When Matt Goodwin was interviewed by Winston Marshall a few weeks ago, he said something that I wanted to explore. In effect, he said, in the most mocking tone he could conjure up out of his adenoidal voice, he said that Restore would find it impossible to canvass on the doorstep in Britain. Here's his exact words.
I was thinking how utterly absurd it would be to watch some of those people campaign in Gorton and Denton, right? Knock on the door, boom, boom, boom. Hello, where are you from? Oh, I'm from Restore. All right, what do you believe? Yeah,
You should be deported.
we believe in mass deportations. Oh, right. Oh, what else do you believe? We believe in remigration. Oh, what's that? Let me tell you something. It's completely divorced from political reality. The people who are pushing those ideas have never canvassed, have never campaigned, have never spent a serious amount of time with the British people.
That's what he said. And there's a few things here that he's saying and implying and assuming. Let's list them. Number 1. The vast majority of the British public would be aghast at Restore's remigration policies. 2. The extreme nature of Restore's policies would make it impossible for Restore to do any door knocking. 3. The purpose of door knocking is to win over potential voters there and then. That's an assumption he's making. 4. Door knocking to change people's minds is vital for a political party to get anywhere. Again, an assumption he's making. I'm going to focus on 3 and 4 to start with. Goodwin mocks Restore people for never having done any campaigning on the ground. And it's true that many will not have done so. But I have. Not a lot. I don't claim to be an experienced hand, but I did do a few days door knocking for the Conservative Party many, many years ago. And I did assume that it was all about changing people's minds on the doorstep to create some voters for your party. But the people running the operation soon disabused me of this notion. The purpose of door knocking, they said, with a practiced world weariness, is to get your vote out. That is, convince the people who normally vote for you to turn out and vote for you again in the upcoming election. Oh, right, I said, a bit surprised and disappointed. They went on. Forget about trying to convert voters on the doorstep. That never happens. It's a blue moon event. The best you can achieve is to convince someone who normally votes for you, but who is wavering and considering UKIP, to stick with the Tories, but even that is difficult. The main job is just to convince your base to turn up on the day and put the cross in the square. That is your job, and do not waste a second on trying to convince someone who isn't in the base. Okay, I said, but how will we know who's a regular voter for us? And at that point they brought out the clipboards and the printouts. On the printouts they had details for every house in the neighbourhood, with an estimate of who they were thought to support. You must only visit the houses of people who are thought to support us, they said. You also had to take notes afterwards on whether you thought they still supported us or had changed, e.g. become a UKIP voter or a Labour or Lib Dem voter, or whether there were new people there now and who did they support if they said. The one thing you mustn't do is spend time going to non-supporters' houses. This was mainly because it was a waste of time, and time is what you didn't have. Door knocking is extremely time-consuming. More on that later. So this is the first reason why I was rather incredulous when I heard Goodwin's claims. He was acting like you just have to knock on enough doors and argue your case, and if you're offering something that people want, they'll vote for you. But it doesn't happen like that. That's not what door knocking is about. Yes, you might very occasionally change someone's mind on the doorstep, but that's only going to happen rarely. Door knocking isn't going to do it for you as a strategy if it's for anything more than getting your base out. So the idea that Restore is screwed because their ideas are too extreme to win any doorstep converts is silly, even if it was completely true that their ideas are too extreme for doorstep conversion. It's silly because doorstep conversions are a chimera. Here's the other issue with the idea of changing people's minds on the doorstep as a serious tactic. Matt Goodwin has said that he knocked on 7,000 doors. Actually, it's not entirely clear how many doors he knocked on, because he also said on the Winston Marshall Show interview that he looked 7,000 voters in the eyes. But as I found, with many of the doors you knocked on, no one was home. So if you knocked on 7,000 doors, you would not have met 7,000 voters. So did he knock on more doors? Or did he knock on 7,000 doors and look at 4,000 voters in the eyes? We don't know. It doesn't matter anyway. Let's take it as 7,000 doors. Now, even if you only spend 5 minutes on each door, which I think is the bare minimum you could get away with, that's 35,000 minutes. Let's call it 36,000 to make the maths easier. 36,000 minutes is 600 hours. So Matt Goodwin spent at least 600 hours door knocking. Minutes would come down due to a lot of people not being home. But if you genuinely are having proper conversations with people, as Goodwin implies he is, not just a perfunctory handing over of a leaflet, then the minutes go up again. Let's face it, it would be very hard to change people's minds if you're not talking to them for very long. But if it's, say, an average of 10 minutes per house, then you're talking 1,200 hours. Now, if you work the equivalent of a 40-hour week doing this, i.e. 5 8-hour days a week, then 1,200 hours is 30 weeks of full-time work. Even if it was only 600 hours, you're still talking 15 weeks of full-time work. Did Matt Goodwin really do 15 to 30 weeks of full-time work, personally knocking on doors? Maybe he did. I'm not here to cast doubt on that. I'm just pointing out how incredibly time-consuming this is. 15 to 30 weeks of full-time work. Even more if you want to do a really good job and have a long chat with people you think are right for converting. But what would it achieve? Suppose 4,000 people were at home. You talk to 4,000 people. But how many are people who don't vote for you but who may possibly change their vote to your party if you can do a good enough job of convincing them? Let's say 1 in 10, which seems a generous assumption. That's 400 people you might convince. But how many do you actually manage to convince? Let's say 1 in 5. Again, a generous assumption. That's 80 people you've convinced to switch to voting for you by personally turning up to their house and speaking to them. But in the general election, 80 people is way too small a number to make any difference. Even if we are even more generous and suppose that your amazing powers of persuasion convince half of these potential voters to vote for you, we're still only talking 200 people. And 200 people are still way too small to make any difference to almost all elections. Yes, very occasionally there may be an extraordinarily close election where 80 or 200 people does swing the election your way, but for almost all elections it isn't enough. So as Matt Goodwin himself discovered, door knocking is a hell of a lot of work for very little reward, if your reason for doing it is trying to convert people. That's why I was told that the job of door knocking was to get the base out, not to win converts on the doorstep. Door knocking is very, very time consuming, so even with volunteers on tap, you need to focus on what is effective. That is also why modern political parties focus so much their efforts on the internet. It's vastly more efficient than tramping the streets, hopelessly trying to convince people one by one. And unlike the old days, where it was difficult to reach people with political messages, these days everyone is on the internet, and everyone is politicised. But not boomers, you say? Yes, even boomers. As The Guardian recently explained, an EU-funded research project found that older people are spending an increasing amount of their free time online. In 2025, the industry regulator Ofcom found that Britons aged over 65 now spend a record 3 hours and 20 minutes a day online. And, as The Guardian complains, an awful lot of that time is now spent looking at political content. Why bother knocking on doors when you can reach people, even boomers, online? Do you think the Greens' sudden rise is because they worked incredibly hard at door knocking? No doubt they did do a lot of door knocking with all their dead keen volunteers, but no one believes that that is why they have suddenly exploded. It's the internet and word of mouth, not door knocking, that has done that. So Matt Goodwin's assumption 4, that door knocking is vital for a political party to get anywhere, is rather doubtful. So if we look back at his assumptions 3 and 4, 3 being the purpose of door knocking is to win over potential voters there and then, and 4 is door knocking to change people's minds is vital for a political party to get anywhere, we can see that they are rather dubious. First of all, the purpose of door knocking is not generally to win over potential voters there and then, as 3 asserts. Of course, you could just make it your purpose, but that brings us to 4. Door knocking to change people's minds is very ineffective and highly inefficient, especially in the internet age, and I think Restore are well aware of that, even if Matt Goodwin isn't, or pretends he isn't. Let's not forget that Goodwin is an extremely online person himself, who relentlessly mined his Gorton and Denton campaigning for social media purposes. Now, none of this means that Restore shouldn't do any door knocking, even though they don't yet have a base to get out. Because they're so new, they have to use every available opportunity to make themselves known to people. And door knocking is not a bad way for an entirely new party to establish themselves publicly as an active force in a local area, to show that we're here and we're running candidates. And with the high number of volunteers they're getting, that can be done. Also, as a new party, they will have no established voter records to fall back on. So if they want to build up such records, they'll have to use door knocking. There's also another factor that comes into play with Restore, which is that, unlike Reform, they're appealing to people who've dropped out of participating in politics. And there's arguably more chance of convincing them on the doorstep to start voting again than it is for a Reform candidate to convince some dyed-in-the-wool Tory voter who hasn't yet left the party to vote Reform. Ironically, Restore might have a better shot at using door-knocking to create voters than Reform. Let's now look back at Goodwin's claims 1 and 2. 1 was, the vast majority of the British public would be aghast at Restore's re-migration policies. 2 is, the extreme nature of Restore's policies would make it impossible for Restore to do any door-knocking. We can immediately see that even if 2 was true, it would be irrelevant. Restore doesn't need to go out knocking on every door it can trying to change people's minds. It looks like maybe they are doing that, but they don't need to. As I said, though, there are other reasons to door knock for them. Out of interest, though, is 2 even true? I don't think so, and here we can look at claim 1 as well. Now, of course, if Restore went knocking on doors in heavily diversified areas, they would get a lot of people angry at them, and there'd be a lot of abuse thrown. Of course, but so what? Lots of groups are hostile to each other in modern Britain. We can't all be friends in 2026, and if you're making that the basis of your party's policies, as Reform are, you're living in the past. Much of that same diversity is also hostile to Reform anyway, as they lump all these parties together, as Matt Goodwin himself discovered. He wrote in The Spectator after his campaign that, one night in Longsight, where nearly half the locals weren't born in Britain, 3 Muslim lads blocked the street and stared me down. One got his phone out, others glared from windows. After husting me back into our van and whisking me away, my security guard told me, "You can't canvass here again." Does Goodwin think that this has any significance for Reform? No. So why should Restore be bothered by the same attitudes? In fact, Restore should be even less bothered, as they don't kid themselves that they're going to get any significant support from the migrants like Reform do. Restore will also face hostility from the blue-haired leftists, but again, this is of no significance in itself. They are A, political enemies of Restore, and B, nuts, so of course they'll be hostile. Big deal. The same blue hairs scream blue murder at every vaguely right-wing politician. They think exactly the same of Reform, as Goodwin himself confirmed, but this doesn't remotely concern Goodwin. He writes in that same Spectator article, "GB News," shouted one middle-aged cat lady on her doorstep before I'd said a word. "Reform UK," she screamed louder. "You're a total wanker." She slammed the door in my face. Goodwin treats this as nothing more than an occasion for an amusing anecdote. So why should Restore be bothered by that sort of thing? The more serious, or at least less silly accusation that can be drawn out of Goodwin's somewhat confused comments, is that the ordinary, normal Briton, the sort who Restore hopes to attract, will also be hostile to Restore on the doorstep, and repelled by their policies to such an extent that door-knocking will be impossible for Restore everywhere, whereas this is not the case for milder, common-sense Reform candidates. I think this is nonsense, though. To start with, we can note the general point that the majority of Britons have consistently been against mass migration for as long as they have been polled on it. And amongst ordinary Britons, that number will be far higher. An anti-immigrant party starts off as a party that the majority of ordinary people will be in sympathy with, especially in 2026 when they've seen what decades of mass immigration has wrought. Of course, ordinary people have also been socialised over decades to not be racist, so we have this incredibly uneasy situation where the average person doesn't want his country being filled up with foreigners, but is also at pains to condemn anything racist. Is this an unsolvable conundrum for Restore? Not really. For one thing, unlike Goodwin's ridiculous impression, they won't knock on doors and just out and out say straight away, "We want to send all the darkies back," or something like that. String them up. They're hardly going to present their views in the most inflammatory way on the doorstep to strangers. Also, they're not even an ethno-nationalist party. Though their policies amount in practice, if carried through with, to something that an ethno-nationalist might be reasonably happy with, they aren't explicitly ethno-nationalist. And a door knocker will be advised to proceed cautiously and present policies in a more sober manner. If the person who opens the door is a migrant who looks hostile from the get-go, just ask if they want a leaflet and quickly leave. If, though, the canvasser thinks they're as promised with the person who opened the door, they could say something like, "We would like to send illegal immigrants and foreign criminals home. policies which even Matt Goodwin thinks are doorstep winners. The Restore people will have more carefully thought of what should be said at the start. The point is that you start with some less controversial points. If these produce a bad reaction, then again, offer a leaflet and leave. If the reaction is very bad, don't even offer a leaflet. Just say, I can see you're not open to this, so I'll bid you good day. If the reaction isn't bad, then the door knocker could go further. We would also like to deport foreign nationals who are on welfare, or whatever. You could also throw in other things like climate change, because Restore isn't just a one-issue party. All of these individual policies are likely to find a sympathetic audience in many households, although obviously not all, when presented in this specific manner, rather than presented in the style of Goodwin's sweeping, ludicrous caricature. So, despite what Goodwin says, it's not hard for Restore canvassers to present themselves in a plausible, sympathetic manner, using some common sense. I also note that Goodwin himself is happy to use the language of remigration. Just the other day he tweeted, 2/3 of all British people back the mass deportation of illegal migrants. It is not right-wing, it is the mainstream view in this country. Act accordingly. So, somehow we're supposed to believe there's a massive difference between shouting about the remigration of illegal migrants, which according to Goodwin, correctly, is a massively popular policy that ordinary people on the doorstep embrace, and sober talk from Restore about remigration of legal migrants? Yes, there is a difference, and I don't deny that there is a difference in attitudes over it. But is that difference in attitudes really as massive as Goodwin claims? Is it really the case that one is massively popular with ordinary people, while the other is reviled by the same ordinary people? We're not talking about Guardian journalists who despise both policies. We're talking about ordinary people. Well, the very same ordinary people who embrace the idea of remigrating illegals get out the shotgun if you say you also want remigration of legals. Some may not approve of that, sure, but do they really see this as totally beyond the pale and sickening beyond belief? Or would they just see it as going a bit further than reform? I would think that for many ordinary people, they don't consider what Goodwin says to be that different to what Restore says. Especially when you consider that many people are under the mistaken impression that most of the migrants walking the streets who they want gone are illegals. There are, of course, people who will passionately hate Restore, but these people will passionately hate reform too. So the differences in attitudes towards both parties with those people isn't very big either. Now, Goodwin's main evidence for there supposedly being this massive difference in ordinary attitudes to reform and Restore's positions is the fact that he's knocked on lots of doors, and as a result has gotten an impression of what ordinary people want. But even assuming we can trust what he says, which I don't think is a given, as he's a highly partisan actor, but even assuming he is sincere in what he says here, we must note that the view you get of ordinary people's attitudes from door knocking is rather limited and one-sided. Most people who talk to you on the doorstep, apart from the occasional shit-stirrer, are people who are sympathetic to your party to start with. But then most of them don't want to get bogged down in a long and contentious discussion. They've got things to do, so they're going to be agreeable and go along with what you say, sort of knowing your attitude in advance and being cautious not to say anything you might consider controversial. Every party canvasser comes away from door knocking convinced that the people on the doorstep are in tune with what the door knocker thinks. I have an example here right from the Gorton and Denton by-election itself from a Green canvasser who said, "It seems surprising that I spoke to only one person who openly said they were set on voting for reform." But crucially, he admits that he identified myself as a Green Party volunteer to everyone who answered the door. Not surprisingly then, he found that when speaking to people who are unconvinced, I followed my question about voting intention with, "What is your main concern for the local area?" And none of them said demographic collapse, illegal immigration, or the loss of British culture to foreign invaders. But of course most right-wingers, apart from the odd brazen one, aren't going to say that sort of thing to a local Green political activist, especially when that activist knows where they live. Most aren't even going to talk to a Green activist at all. I also note that he admits he was canvassing in an area that was known to be strongly Green. So I take perceptions of what the ordinary British person thinks that are formed on the doorstep by political canvassers with a large grain of salt, and that especially applies to a slippery character like Goodwin. So, should we take seriously Goodwin's sneering claim that Restore won't even be able to door knock because they're so extreme? Nah. Finally, and importantly, I note that Restore has already been doing door knocking, and by all reports it has been going well. Of course, Restore Canvass's reports are going to be as biased as every other Canvass's reports, but it does seem to be the case that ordinary people are not reviling them on the doorstep and spitting at them, but are, rather, interested in hearing a different perspective. No doubt Restore have advised their canvassers sensibly to avoid getting dragged into unseemly situations with blue hairs and migrants. So I don't buy Goodwin's claims that his experience on the doorstep shows him that the British people will find Restore's positions abhorrent and impossible to present in person to ordinary British people. This is just nakedly self-serving bullshit from a political rival and operative, and no one should take it seriously.